Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you have had a chance to enjoy some simple sandwich before this. Otherwise, you may be hungry for the next 1 hour and a half, except we'll have a lot of good food for thought to help you. So today, we're really very fortunate, very happy to have Professor Greenstone to come and speak on the global energy challenge, opportunities for better balancing economic growth and environmental quality in China. I know even in Hong Kong, it's very hard not to notice the pollution and so on. So it used to be, until a couple of years ago, you only had to be in Beijing to know what it is like to suffer from air pollution and so on. So now we don't have to travel to Beijing anymore and can see that in Hong Kong. So Professor Greenstone is a Milton Friedman professor at the University of Chicago. So he holds several different positions, including the director of the Becker-Friedman Institute and also the Global Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. I was almost going to say the University of Hong Kong, but avoided this mistake. And he was the chief economist in the Obama administration, or the chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors to President Obama. So I guess I was in a better days for the U.S. Administration. And his research has influenced policy and as well as the academic community, especially on the environment and on energy. So without further ado, let's first welcome Professor Greenstone again. So we'll go as follows. So Professor Greenstone will spend the next 45 to 50 minutes to give his presentation, and then we'll take questions from you. All right?
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here today. I'd be happy to take questions at the end, but at Chicago, one thing is that people express their feelings by yelling at the speaker. So if there's something that's bothering you or something that's unclear, you should feel free to ask a question in the middle. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the global energy challenge and opportunities for better balancing economic growth and environmental quality in China. And this picture, which is from Beijing from now several years ago, is, I think, very well captures what I like to think of as a global energy challenge. I think of the global energy challenge as kind of a stool with 3 legs. This picture captures all 3 legs of that stool. So the first thing when you look at this picture is you can immediately see China is a country on the make. You can feel, it's visceral. You can feel the motion, you can feel the action. You can see it was not that long ago that the guy in a car was probably on a bike, and it's not that long until the guy on a bike is going to be in a car. And in the last 25 or 30 years, China has had, by historical standards, an unprecedented increase in income. And all of that has been facilitated by access to inexpensive and reliable energy. So that's the first leg of the global energy challenge, the stool of the global energy challenge, is how do you make sure societies have access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy. The second leg of the stool is also immediately apparent there too. And you can see it's the middle of the day, it's Beijing, and you can't see the sun. The guy's got on the goggles, he has on the face mask. The same pollution that's powering all that economic growth the same energy that is powering all that economic growth is coming bundled with pollution. And that pollution imposes costs on people's well-being. It causes them to lead shorter and sicker lives. And so the second leg of the stool is how do you minimize the environmental consequences of lots of energy consumption? And the third leg of the stool, it's not as visible, but you know it's there, which is that the same energy consumption that's producing all this economic growth and producing the haze and the particulate matter also involves the release of CO2. And how do you minimize the probability of disruptive climate change that constitutes the third leg of the stool? So what I'll try and talk about is that I think this global energy challenge really, it's not a climate problem, it's not a pollution problem, it's not an energy problem. It's how you try to navigate between those three sets of goals. And at the end of the day, it requires societal trade-offs. It's not hard to think of policies that are effective at achieving one or two of those legs of the stool, but it's very difficult to come up with policies that improve all three of those at once. So to illustrate that, I think there's 7 facts that I think help explain the difficult balance between energy and growth, which I'll try to run through here first. And the first is, some of them are obvious, and I think hopefully stitched together they'll paint a richer picture. But the first is that energy is critical for growth. And I like, for people who work with data all the time, like I do, I like to, if you think back to, maybe this isn't true for you, but it was true for me when I was if you think back to like the worst boyfriend or girlfriend you ever had when you were in high school, like what was true about them? At least for me, what was true is that they were going to be disappointing. I could never really predict exactly in what way, but I was certain that it was going to be disappointing. And so analyzing data is a little bit like that. The data never quite exactly fit what you think. This is a rare exception. And what it shows is an extraordinarily tight relationship between energy demand, or energy consumption, and GDP per capita. And the key thing I want you to take away from it is we just don't have historical examples of countries achieving high levels of living standards without consuming lots of energy. So energy is critical for growth. The second is that energy access is a major problem in a lot of parts of the world. So here I've just picked some various parts of the world, and you can see that electricity consumption per capita in the United States is about 13,000 kilowatt hours per person. In Germany, it's about 7,000. In China, it's about 3,800. These are probably a couple years old now. And then I'll just point out, in India, it's about 800 kilowatt hours per person. In the state of Bihar, which is home to more than 100 million people in India, it's just about 130 kilowatt hours per person. And so the only point I want to make is, if you're sitting in Bihar, this is not an acceptable state of affairs. If you're sitting in India, generally it's not an acceptable state of affairs. And even in China, I suspect there's desire to have higher energy consumption. And so there's just no changing that that's going to be part of the equation going forward. And indeed, demand, if one looks at projections for demand, it's projected to grow most rapidly outside of the OECD countries. So here, this is just the last 50 years. This is total energy consumption per capita. And you can see that for about the last 40 years, it's been roughly constant in the United States. And then in the kind of green line, you can see the really historic growth that started to take place beginning in the early 90s in China, showing up in their energy consumption. And if you look hard enough, you can begin to see the beginnings of that happening in India as well. But so that's the last 50 years. If you go forward, extend it to 2035, you can see that basically all of the world's energy growth is projected to come from countries that are currently outside the OECD. Okay, so that's fine. Energy is critical for growth. People want a lot of energy, and the growth is projected to primarily occur outside the OECD. What sources of energy are people going to turn to? And the fourth fact is that all the standard projections are that fossil fuels are expected to supply most of this growth. So this is just projecting energy consumption from roughly the present out to 2040. The three bottom bars are the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. And what's striking is that today, about 81% of energy consumption comes from those fossil fuels. But even when you go out to 2040, that doesn't change very much. It's still projected to be about 74%. Almost 3/4 of energy consumption will still be from fossil fuels. So even though there's been tremendous growth in renewables, it's against a very low base. And the fossil fuels are projected to, by all the standard models, projected to be the dominant source of energy going forward. So why is that? What's driving the reliance on fossil fuels? And the answer, at least to an economist's eye, is not very surprising. It's energy markets, and the way that we've constructed energy markets are pushing people to use fossil fuels. And so this is for the United States. Obviously, it's going to vary from place to place. But you can see in the United States, this is the cost of producing a kilowatt hour of electricity from a bunch of different sources: an existing coal plant, a new natural gas plant where the United States is benefiting from the fracking revolution, a new coal plant that would require all kinds of environmental controls, and then some low carbon energy sources. And the main thing I want you to take away from that is that the cost of energy is, the cost of moving to non-fossil fuel sources of energy is probably 3 or 4 times larger. And we'll come back to this number. I'm sure this doesn't conform with everything that people read in the paper, but we can come back to it. But the key thing I want you to take away is in the power markets, the fossil fuels are predominant because they're the least expensive. That's not just true in power, it's also true in transportation. And this figure is, there's a lot of motion on this figure, so let me try and go through it clearly. What I've done here is tried to develop the lifetime cost of owning an internal combustion engine, so that's the purchase price plus all the gasoline, and compare that to the lifetime cost of owning an electric vehicle, which is the purchase price and then the electricity charge. And then what I want to show with this line is an equal cost line. And along this line, it's equally costly to own an electric vehicle as it is to own an internal combustion engine. And so what is varying along that line? On the x-axis, I've got the cost of batteries. And on the y-axis, I have the price of a barrel of oil. And what you can see is, and so now let me try, and so in the pink area, internal combustion engines are cheaper than electric vehicles, and in the blue area, the electric vehicles are cheaper than the internal combustion engines. So let's just take a look at a couple important points along that line. So if you take Tesla's pricing seriously for their Powerwall product, which is for use at homes, it's about $400 per kilowatt hour. And actually installed it's probably more, but that's, anyway, the list price is about $400 per kilowatt hour. So what price of a barrel of oil would be necessary for it to be equal cost? Well, the break-even price of oil would have to be $540 a barrel. So the current price is about $65 a barrel. So what this is saying is that the electric vehicles are way, way out of the money. And that's setting aside issues of range anxiety. Well, you could say, well, the batteries are getting a lot better. The Department of Energy is projecting that actually maybe you could get them for $260 a kilowatt hour. In that case, the break-even price of oil would be $310 a barrel, still 5 times the market price. And the DOE is targeting a cost of $125 per kilowatt hour sometime in the 2020s, and that would require maybe a doubling of the price of oil. So the only point I want to make is, in the power sector, the way energy markets are constructed, it's pushing people to choose fossil fuels. It's also true in the transportation sector. Okay, not only is that true, but fossil fuels remain incredibly abundant. And this is what I've plotted here is the ratio of oil reserves to production ratio. So that's like how much we know is there divided by how much we used in a given year. And so if we just start with the beginning, which is this figure, which is 1985, there was like 35 years of oil that we knew and we could easily get. If we didn't find any more oil, the world, this thing would have gone straight down, and by 2015 should have been zero, basically. The opposite happened. That went up. And why did it go up? It went up because we're finding oil even faster than we're using it. And so by the present, there's about 50 years worth of oil at current consumption levels. So the only point I want you to take is the idea that we're going to run out of fossil fuels is totally contradicted by the data. In fact, the world is completely awash in fossil fuels right now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. This is just showing the same thing for natural gas and coal. Okay, so that's fine. We're going to use a lot of, it looks like there's markets are constructed to use fossil fuels. There's a lot of them. They're cheap. That should be celebrated. Remember, one of the goals is how to make sure we have inexpensive and reliable energy. The problem with that is that fossil fuels come bundled with pollution, and that pollution shortens lives. So let me tell you a little bit about a paper that I just published last fall that tries to measure what the impacts of air pollution associated with the consumption of fossil fuels are on life expectancy. And this is based on Hawaii River policy. So the way the Hawaii River policy works, at least as I understand it, is that it was established in the planning period when there weren't enough resources to provide heating for everyone in the winter. And so what China did is they drew a line, and I'll show you the line in a minute, across the country, and they said, you know what, if you live north of this line, we're going to give you free winter heating between November 15th and March 15th. And if you live south of the line, it's not just that we're not going to give you the free coal, we're not going to build you boilers, it's actually going to be illegal to have winter heating. And obviously as the market economy has taken hold there, some of that has started to break down, but the legacy of that still exists. Indeed, I gave a lecture at a university in Chengdu several years ago in a room not like this in the winter, unlike this in the winter, and all the students had on winter coats. It's just a norm that in north of China, there's not a lot of heat in the winter. In the south, sorry. So here's the line. The line follows the Hawaii River. When the river peters out, it kind of turns into the mountain range. But the idea of the paper is, well, gosh, this doesn't follow any administrative regions. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could compare people who live just to the north of the river to people who live just to the south of the river and try and understand what the consequences of this policy are. And I should just point out the way that the heating was provided in the north was not to build a giant central power station way out away from where people live, but actually connected to almost all apartment buildings are these kind of very small boilers with not a lot of pollution abatement equipment installed. And so you have the heat being generated and the pollution being generated right where the people live. Okay. This was done by obtaining data and collaborating with the Chinese CDC and using the Chinese disease surveillance point system. And I think it helps illustrate that there's a treasure trove of data in China that can help understand and guide policy. And so the paper basically boils down to two figures, and I want to just turn to them now. So what I've done here is this vertical line is the Hawaii River, and then each bubble calculates the pollution concentration at 1 degree latitude displacements from the line. So this bubble is people who live within 1 degree north of the line, and this bubble is people who live within 1 degree south of the line. And the size of the bubble is just proportional to the number of people who live there. What I want you to take, or what I don't want you, what the data are trying to say when you look at this is that as you move towards the river's edge and then cross it, there's a discrete change in pollution concentrations. And indeed, this is in PM10, not in PM2.5. In PM10, pollution concentrations go up by about 50% as you cross the river. And so remember, the experiment that I have in mind here is, well, let's compare people who live just to the north, just to the south. So what this shows is that due to this policy, there's a lot more exposure to air pollution in the north. Now, the next figure I'm going to show you is for life expectancy. And what's striking about it is it also has a discrete jump, but there's a jump down. And so the people who live just to the south of the policy, on average, just to the south of the Wye River, on average live about 3 years less than the people who live just to the north. And that is coming from elevated mortality rates due to cardiorespiratory diseases. There's no difference in car accidents, there's no difference in other causes of death that are unrelated, that are not plausibly related to air pollution. And so what you can do is you can put these two figures together, and it helps provide and measure, and I will come back to this as we move along, of exactly how many life years are being lost for each 10-unit change in PM10. Excellent, yeah.
Yeah, will people migrate in the long run?
Yeah. Okay. So what is one thing that's, I think, appealing about this from a pure research perspective is that I wrote 2 papers on this. One was using data from the 90s and one from 2008 to 2012. Is it, particularly the one from the 90s, there wasn't a lot of migration yet. And so when I saw someone living in a particular place, I knew that they'd been there for their whole life. And now with the more recent data, there's certainly the possibility of migration, and I expect that as opportunities for movement increase, there's there'll be more movement.
So each city each circle represents a particular city?
Everyone who lives within 1 degree latitude. Sometimes there's multiple cities within each of those bubbles.
Because the problem is you look at very limited measurement stations.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you take care of that point?
Yeah. Excellent. So I got the Chinese environmental yearbooks have data on all these monitors going back to the 80s actually, and so I kind of hand entered all that, and then I assign pollution to each place based on a weighted average of all the monitors within 150 kilometers. But good question. Okay, so that's 5. 6 is that fossil fuels are also causing climate change, and climate change obviously produces a lot of challenges for society. So let me talk about this. So first, like returning to, are we ever going to run out of fossil fuels? Well, in the context of climate change, the answer is no. This is all the warming that is available. So the climate scientists kind of drive me crazy with their like gigatons of CO2. I don't understand what that means. So what I did is I converted everything into temperature and temperature increases. And so we've already baked into the system almost this is Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. This is fossil fuel proved reserves. That's how much warming we know we can get with today's technologies at today's prices. And then these are resources. This is how much we could get if prices were a little bit higher. So there's like almost an unimaginable amount of warming available in the ground. And that's what you should take away from that. Now, what might be the consequences of all that warming? So here I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that I'm currently working on. It's not public yet, on the unequal effects of weather and climate change, evidence from mortality in India. So just to level set here, this is the current distribution of daily temperatures in India. So the typical person in India faces about 60 days a year where the temperature's between 79 and 81. and you can see a couple days a year where it's greater than 97. And I'm very bad at the conversion from 32 is 90 degrees, right? And 35 is 95. I think that's right. So this is the current distribution. What is projected, the distribution of temperatures, what is that projected to be at the end of the century with unmitigated climate change? You would see this enormous shift in distribution and a piling up of days at the very high end. The reason that's relevant is that the bad stuff, so a lot of the bad stuff associated with climate change comes at those very hot days. I'll show you, there's a very nonlinear relationship. So like an extra day that turns, a 65-degree day into a 67-degree day is much different than an extra day that turns a 90-degree day into a 92-degree day. So let's just start with what is the effect of daily temperature on annual mortality in the United States? And what you can see is that hot days do increase mortality rates relative to a day in a more moderate 70 to 74 range. But what I've hidden from you here is that the y-axis is very compressed here. And in fact, if we stretch it out a little bit, that same blue response function, this is the same blue response function, it's almost imperceptible. And what this says is, in the US, there's almost no relationship between daily temperatures and mortality. Now, the reason I stretch out the y-axis is because I want to show you the same thing, except I want to show it to you for India now. And what you can see here is that the effect of a hot day on mortality in India is about 20 times what it is in the United States. And it just illustrates that there's a lot of parts of the world that are deeply exposed to, very poorly positioned for climate change, and would there be, quite substantial mortality consequences of that. Okay, so now I'm going to begin to try and pull the different threads together, or at least get you to start to think about that. So let's just return to, remember the goals here, how do we have access to inexpensive and reliable energy? How do we avoid the health problems associated with pollution? And how do we try to avoid disruptive climate change? So with respect to climate change, if you go back from the Industrial Revolution to the present, or let's say 2010, the United States has accounted for about 18% of total greenhouse gas emissions. India is about 4%, and China is about 12%. This has actually changed quite a bit since 2010. But now if you zoom ahead to 2050, and this is cumulative, this is not in a given year, by the middle of the century, the United States share is down to 16%, India's is up to 6%, China is up to 20%, and by the end of the century, it's about, China accounts for almost a quarter, and India maybe 9%. Now, why is this so important? If there's nothing that can be done about the emissions that have already occurred, and so if the world is going to do something about climate change, it's going to have to come from reductions in emissions that are scheduled to occur in China and India and other developing countries. And the reason that is so challenging, of course, is these are the very parts of the world that have, by and large, relatively low levels of energy consumption, and are the parts of the world where energy consumption is so valuable for unlocking economic growth. And yet the only way to avoid these large increases in greenhouse gas emissions is by purchasing more expensive energy. That is the low carbon sources. So that is kind of at the crux of the global energy challenges, that the very places that need more energy consumption the most, to avoid disruptive climate change, will have to spend more on energy. Now, who pays for it is a different issue. Could be that there's some global fund. I think the prospects for that are not very great anymore. But the greenhouse gas, to avoid disruptive climate change, greenhouse gas emissions reductions are largely going to have to take place in today's developing, in India, China. I don't think you'd call China a developing country anymore, but in the non-OECD countries. Okay, so the last fact, and then I'm going to turn to some policy solutions. is that the Paris Agreement is expected to help, and then I would say you could kind of view, but maybe a little bit less than we thought. So just to level set, without any global policy, this was the expected path for greenhouse gas emissions around the globally. It would lead by the end of the century to about a 4.5 degrees C increase in temperature, and further increases after that. The scientists, I don't think, I'm not sure that we should trust the scientists with economics, but what they say is that we should be on a 2-degree path. That would look, emissions would have to follow something like this. And then the Paris Agreement, which really only runs through 2025 or 2030, so if you make some assumptions about what it might look like after that, kind of is somewhere in between. And so you can think of that, the Paris Agreement is kind of like a glass half empty or glass half full. It would get the world off the red line, and that would be a huge step, maybe not all the way to the green line. Now, of course, the Paris Agreement is voluntary, and the United States commitment to that voluntary nature has probably declined by anyone's definition in the last year and a half or so. And here's a picture of our president announcing the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think that probably is going to have ripple-on effects around the world as other countries feel less pressure to try and meet whatever their goals were. Okay, so I think that's background or level setting of how I see the global energy challenge. So now let's talk. My wife sometimes accuses me of that being a slightly gloomy talk. So let's talk about what might be some solutions here. And the first, I think, is straight, in terms of the raw economics is very easy. In terms of the politics, can be quite complicated. But the first is, well, energy is not really being priced at its full cost. And so this is a version of the graph we looked at before in the power sector, and it just shows you that the energy markets are pushing people to use fossil fuels. In this case, this is a nuclear plant, this is a combined cycle natural gas plant, this is a coal plant with environmental controls. You could think of it as being about 3 cents a kilowatt hour without environmental controls. But basically, the renewables look out of the money, nuclear looks out of the money, and natural gas in the US and most parts of the world, coal really look like the winner. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that doesn't account for those two other legs of the stool that we talked about. It doesn't account for the costs imposed by climate change, and it doesn't account for the health costs from pollution. So what happens if we insert the cost of climate change into energy prices and have energy prices reflect that? Well, the first thing that happens right away is coal now looks like it's way out of the money. Nuclear suddenly looks a lot closer. The natural gas price is going to vary depending on what part of the world you're in. Right now we have very low natural gas prices in the United States. And you can see the renewables with, and we can probably come back to this in the question and answer session, with natural gas backup are closer to being in the money. And now the size of the green bar is based on what the US government social cost of carbon is. And that is an estimate of what the cost of an extra ton of CO2 does in terms of damages. But do we actually know what that number is, what is referred to as the social cost of carbon? That is, how much should polluters be paying for and the short answer is almost everything we know comes from a series of papers that were published or some work that was done maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And at their core, these three models have damage functions which show the relationship between the global mean temperature increase and the shared GDP loss. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But what I just first want to point out is that those three models are now pretty dated. And in particular, they all relied on work on what the cost of climate change might be. There were very few, they relied on very few studies, and most of those studies were from the 1990s. What they miss is an explosion of research that I've contributed to that really began in the late 2000s and is now greatly deepening our understanding of what the costs of climate change are going to be. And so indeed, I'm helping to lead something called the Climate Impact Lab, where we're trying to update our understanding of what the cost of climate change will be. And let me give you a sneak preview at what we're beginning to find. These 3 lines are the 3 damage functions that we looked at. Thus far, if you just look at the mortality consequences, never mind the impact on crops, never mind the impact on labor productivity, never mind the impact on sea level rise, which is obviously an issue for Hong Kong, it looks like just the mortality impacts are about as large as what the 3 previous models were finding for the full damages. So if you went back to this, that implies that these green bars would be even bigger. And by incorporating the climate costs into these energy markets, you could greatly alter the choices that people and companies will make. Let me just raise one other point of why it's so important to get the correct value of the cost, social cost of carbon, or reliable number, is because effectively that tells you how expensive policy, that tells you how much you should be willing to spend on policies that reduce carbon. So for example, the US social cost of carbon right now is about $42. It turns out, at least in the US, there's the pursuit of a lot of policies that are much more expensive than that reduce carbon at a price of much higher than $42 a ton. And if the true cost is $42, we shouldn't be doing any of these policies because the costs exceed the benefits. I think Hong Kong had a very generous policy on electric vehicles. There's a lot of, I've been in cabs that are Teslas. I'm sure that those are entirely subsidized. If this were put to this test, it would probably look like that was not such a great policy. And I'll just note, of course, there's way more efficient policies available, like cap and trade policies, which China is pursuing for CO2, and that the various parts of the United States and Europe have. Okay, so we talked about the green bar. Energy prices should also reflect the health costs that come with relying on fossil fuels. And here I've just added in an estimate of what the health costs from particulates are. And you can see that further tilts the playing field away from the fossil fuels. You still use natural gas, but you heavily rely on natural gas. But you can see there's very small, natural gas is relatively clean fossil fuel with respect to particulates. I want to just talk for a minute about some work that we're also doing in Chicago on trying to figure out, well, how big should that red bar really be? In this case, I'm just showing it from the National Academy of Sciences estimate. And so here's, as we talked about, air pollution is a major challenge in population centers around the world. Here's a picture from Delhi. But I think it's not well understood in many parts of the world what are the consequences of that exposure and how citizens and policymakers should evaluate trade-offs between higher energy costs and those health costs. So the primary tool that I think the world uses is the AQI, or the Air Quality Index. And what I want to argue is that this thing is like almost devoid of content. Like, it's got some nice colors. Got to be true that green is better than maroon, although we don't think that at the University of Chicago. Green is certainly better than purple, and certainly better than red. But it doesn't really provide people with information on, well, what does it mean about this exposure to air pollution? And so what we've created is a new metric, which we're calling the Air Quality Life Index. I think it has more value. And so in particular, what the Air Quality Life Index does is it takes that paper based on the Huai River and uses it to convert PM 2.5 concentrations into expected years of lost life expectancy. So for example, this is a map of part of the world. Here we've got China and India, and this is showing this PM 2.5 concentrations. The darker areas are the more heavily polluted. But what we can do is with the Air Quality Life Index, is we can convert that into the number of years that people would live on longer on average if, in this case, the country in this case, China complied with its own Class 2 pollution standards. And of course, that number would be much larger if China were to comply with the WHO standards for PM 2.5, and that's what's depicted here. And so the average person in China would live about 3.5 years longer if China was brought into compliance with the WHO standards. So this is using this Air Quality Life Index idea. Yeah, so we're using there's some places in China where you can measure both PM10 and PM 2.5, and we use that to convert one to the other. This is based on 2.5 satellite data. Good questions. Okay. So anyway, we're building this Air Quality Life Index. We're going to launch a fully interactive tool that will be available for the whole world. And you'll be able to see at a highly localized level, like here in Johannesburg, what pollution concentrations are and what the benefits would be of achieving either national standards or WHO standards. Okay, so I just want to underscore it. One clear policy tool is to just bring get energy prices to reflect the full cost of energy consumption. And that means bringing in the climate costs and bringing in the health costs and forcing consumers to see those prices. That would have an enormous effect. A second is to invest in innovation. It's clear innovation is causing rapid changes in the energy sector. Here are bids for supplying solar electricity to the India grid, and you can see that they're coming almost into the same level as coal prices. A lot of that with Chinese manufactured solar panels. It's also true, of course, that there's innovation not just in renewables, but there's innovation in the fossil fuel sector. And these are shale gas reserves by country. You can see China has the largest. The United States and Canada and Mexico, where there's been a lot of people have begun to access these shale resources, much more than they have in other parts of the world. But I think that's all going to come in the fullness of time. And so there's innovation in all phases. A lot of that innovation has occurred somewhat haphazardly and has not occurred as a conscious policy choice. And that's largely because there's relatively low rates of investment in energy R&D around the world, at least by historical standards. And I think so. The second policy tool that I would advocate for is really ramped up investment in energy R&D. Okay, and then the third tool, which I think is that we don't often pay enough attention to the possibility of devising policies and then assessing whether or not they actually work. And so we often feel happy that we've devised the policy and then just let it go from there and kind of hope for the best. I think actually there's incredible opportunities for devising policies, testing whether or not they work, and then devising future policy based on that. So let me, how might you go about this? So we helped pioneer this idea of research cogeneration. And the idea of cogeneration is that you work with policymakers to identify what the problem is that they want to solve, and then develop a policy that could be responsive to it and test that policy. And to the extent that it's successful, then it can be scaled up. So let me give you an example of this working very effectively in the state of Gujarat in India. So when we start to work with the environmental officials in Gujarat, they said, well, you know, look, there's two ways that we get to see which plants are violating the norms. We send government inspectors as one, but we don't have a lot of money for that, so we can't inspect a lot of plants. The second is we require plants to get third-party audits. So every year they have to get an environmental consulting company to come and take pollution readings and then send the pollution readings to the regulator, and then in principle the plant could be fined if they violate the norms. As they said, well, look, the problem is I look out my window and I see this and it's clear everyone's violating, yet the reports I'm getting from the third-party auditors all say that everything is fine. So we're thinking of ending this program. And we said, well, how does that third-party audit market work? And he said, oh, well, the guys get to choose the person who comes and takes the readings, and they get to pay the guy who comes and takes the readings. And when we went and investigated, it turns out like the auditors were being paid by our estimates about half of what the cost of it would be to actually do the reading on the level. So what we said is, it looks like maybe there's a conflict of interest here, and we devised an intervention that aimed to break that conflict of interest. And to do that, the intervention had three main features. The first was the auditor was randomly assigned to the plant. They couldn't choose their brother to do it anymore. The second is they couldn't pay the auditor directly. They paid to a central pool, and then the pool paid the auditor. And the third is we hired some engineering college students to go around and take readings right after the auditors went to a plant. And if our reading was similar to theirs, then we gave the auditor a cash bonus. But at its core, what we were trying to do was just break the conflict of interest. And then and so we said, okay, so here's the idea. Now it might work, it might not work. And we said, but what we said is, well, we want to test this idea. We want to run a randomized control trial, just like you would with drugs. And the regulator looked at us kind of strange, and we said, no, we're being serious. And eventually, after several conversations, he said, okay, we'll take 1,000 plants. 500 of them will be subject to this treatment that you designed. 500 will continue to hire auditors just as they normally do. Okay, so now let me tell you about the results. So the first thing that we found is that indeed the regulator was getting a message that everyone was in compliance. Here's the standard for PM 2.5, and you can see all the plants are basically to the left of that. I don't know what these plants were failing to do. Presumably they fired those auditors in the next go around, but basically everyone's being reported being compliant. Now what's really cool is that we can actually know the truth because we had these engineering students running around behind the auditors. And when you do that, you can see the truth varies greatly from what the auditors are reporting. So like 60% of the plants are out of compliance. And my favorite part of this is that there's a bunch of plants who had extraordinarily low readings, but the auditors didn't feel safe reporting that. And so they just said, oh, well, they're polluting a lot, but still below the standard. So the first result is that reporting was really corrupt in the status quo. The second is that, this is in the treatment group, this is what the auditors were sending in. And here you can see a much more dispersed reading. You can see a lot of the plants are being reported as being out of compliance. We have our back check readings, and you can see they don't match perfectly what the auditors reported, but it's pretty close. And so the second was that the treatment caused, I wouldn't say it completely severed the conflict of interest, but it greatly reduced it, and it caused the auditors to become more truthful. So that's great. We showed that you don't have to spend any money. You can just change the incentives in a market and get a very different outcome. But the ultimate goal was, what would plants do about pollution emissions? And and so what we wanted to test, so 6 months to a year after this had been running, we went back and took pollution readings from all the plants, and our hypothesis was, well, now that the treatment plants know the regulator's getting reliable information, maybe they're going to change their behavior. And indeed, what we found is that pollution emissions went down by about 30% in the treatment plants relative to the control plants, underscoring that by providing reliable information, the treatment had worked and caused plants to reduce their emissions. So what's really nice about this, though, is it's an interesting paper, but in addition, the Gujarat government was so excited by it that they turned this into policy, and this is now the way the third-party auditing market works in Gujarat. So how could something like this work in China? I actually think there's incredible opportunities for this. I released a report about 2 weeks ago that documented in the last 4 years since China has declared a war on pollution, there's been incredible reductions in air pollution concentrations. You can see this, here's for a bunch of cities. These are the 2013 concentrations. These are the 2017 concentrations. The average city is down by about 30%. The Chinese standard is, I guess you call that a yellow line or orange line, and the green standard is a WHO standard. The only point I want you to take away from this, these were remarkable achievement. There's still a ways to go to get to the orange and much further to get to the green line. A lot of what has been achieved in the last 4 years was achieved in what I like to think of as a kind of a very engineering style approach. It was not very subtle. There was a lot of like wrecking of boilers or forbidding the use of coal or other approaches that were maybe forcing plants to close down. And you know what's going to be important in the years ahead is to find a way to balance the environmental goals with the economic growth goals. And I think ultimately there's a lot of opportunities for pursuing much more subtle and nuanced policies that could be tested in this kind of research cogeneration way with local governments who ultimately are going to be responsible for achieving them. And you can see that there's a lot of evidence of opportunities for finding more effective forms of regulation in China. So let me just close with, I think the global energy challenge is one of the greatest, if not the greatest challenges humankind faces in the coming decades. I think as I said at the outset, I like to think of it as a stool with 3 legs, which is how do we achieve access to inexpensive and reliable energy that's so critical for growth, while also minimizing the health consequences of energy consumption and minimizing the odds of disruptive climate change. Thank you very much.
Okay, so who would like to go first?
I live in Beijing. I also live part of the year in Australia. Now, the global narrative on pollution, energy consumption, as you know, is highly misleading. Australia is perhaps one of the most polluting countries in the world on a per capita basis. They use coal-fired plant, and because of how the country is spread out, people drive and use a lot of petrol. The whole reason why, when we observe Australia, it seems so sparkling clean is because of low population density. And the reason why Beijing or other cities in China looks so polluting, other than a lot of reasons, is high population density. So even taking US as an example, without doing a lot of analysis, energy efficiency in New York City is probably much more efficient than Nebraska or Texas. If most people in the US live in megacities like New York, US as a country will become a lot more energy efficient. And if you look at the global basis, countries like Japan and Korea, particularly if we take out all the energy consumption in heavy industry, steel, shipbuilding, auto, it's a lot more energy efficient than the US, Australia, or Canada. So I think the question is, how can the lesson of Korea and Japan translate globally? How can, without compromising the lifestyle of people, used to living in big houses, suburbs in the US, Canada, how can that demand factor of urban planning, can that be some lessons that can be learned by advanced economies from the lessons of Korea and Japan?
Yeah, I think so first let me just stipulate, this global energy challenge is always going to look, it's going to look a little different depending on where you are. And that's, in fact, the climate problem obviously looks very different than where you are. If you're sitting in Bihar, where per capita electricity consumption is 140 kilowatt hours per person, I think trying to convince people that they should buy more expensive energy today to prevent climate change tomorrow does not look like a really good proposition. So there's just going to be a lot of local heterogeneity. I think you're also raising the question of urbanization and what its role is, and then things will look different there too, particularly with energy consumption and pollution. The carbon element, it doesn't matter where the carbon emissions come from. So, thank you, though.
Social cost of carbon. So previously in the literature, I think there is an estimate of $50.
Yeah.
And notice your number now is 42. Is it
that was just,
yeah.
That's just current dollars versus like $2007. It's the same number.
Oh, it's the same number.
Yeah.
So does it consider like, if we consider the trade between China and the U.S., is it only based on U.S. estimation, or do we consider like?
No, it includes the damages that would occur around the world.
Around the world.
Yeah.
The second question is, when we look at the effects of pollution and temperature on mortality, how we think of, for example, if we want to look at temperature, we control for pollution, and if we want to look at pollution, we control for temperature, but meanwhile, like temperature can affect pollution at the same time. For the case, for example, for winter heating in China, so winter heating also creates, like, protect public health in terms of provide heating to the northern cities. So how do we reconcile those estimates between, like, for example, temperature and pollution?
Yeah, so the pollution I've been looking at is particulates, which is not a function of temperature per se. So I think if you think about ozone, it can be difficult to separate the effects of ozone from the effect of temperature. But obviously the best work tries hard to separate them.
So my question is, given that the trend of climate change cannot be reversed, and as you show in your figure, and also you also find that the impacts of climate change on mortality and other things can be largely mitigated by higher income. So my question is, do you think it's a good idea to focus more on adaptation policies instead of trying to abate pollution, emissions?
Yeah. No, so that's great. So yeah, if we think back to that, and I meant to say this at the time, like, if you're India, you are desperate to get off this red line. This red line is terrible. Like, that's, there's all kinds of death there and sickness. And the best way to do that is to get rich. Because when you get rich, you can buy things like air conditioning and have your income be less temperature dependent. So it's going to have to be a mix of adaptation. There will not be a single strategy here. It's going to have to be a mix of adaptation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I think. But both are important, and I also want to emphasize, like, that problem looks different depending on where you are. If you're in India, it looks very different than it does, say, if you're in the United States.
A question about subsidies. I didn't hear you mention anything about the subsidies that are paid by governments annually to fossil fuels. Do you have a number for that? And if you adjusted your bar chart comparing fossil fuel costs with renewable energy costs, what impact would that show?
Yeah, that's right. There are certainly subsidies, particularly for exploration for a lot of fossil fuels. It's hard to get a very reliable number on that. At the end, even though the numbers on fossil fuel subsidies look big, the total consumption of it has to be divided by the total consumption of fossil fuels, so I don't think it would change that chart very much. And I know it's not an especially popular view, but it is true that the renewables are very expensive, even after the substantial declines in the last decade.
Secondly, I just wanted to ask about the slide you showed earlier on abundance. Can you flip to that?
Yeah, sure.
If I understood it correctly, this is a static view in today's terms of the, it only goes to 2010. I was going to say I thought that was a projection, but if you were to project that, based on what I think are declining reserves, proven reserves of fossil fuels, perhaps with the exception of natural gas, and also increasing consumption, I think you would see a different picture. For
No,
Really?
no. I don't agree.
Expand that. Expand that.
You have to. I think you got to give up on the we're going to run out of fossil fuels view.
No, I'm not. I realise the peak oil theorists are off, but I'm just trying to understand if that's really an honest projection. If you took it forward, I mean, people say.
Well, let me assure you, it's not a dishonest projection, but this is. Let's be very clear. These were known reserves in 1980 divided by consumption in 1980.
Yeah.
Then the same thing in 1981, the same thing in 1982,
Okay. And
all
then,
the way forward.
And then just a question for you, and
Yeah.
if you were to.
And wait, hold on. There's one other thing I want to turn to. Okay, this thing, if you think we're going to run out of fossil fuels, this thing should scare the bejesus out of you. So these are shale gas reserves. I have a similar graph, but I already did 81 slides in 45 minutes or maybe longer. But slide 82 would have been this for petroleum. And I just want to be clear, like, the only parts of the world that have made any progress in exploiting the shale gas so far are basically the US, Canada, and Mexico. This is all untouched to a first approximation, not completely. And I understand it's harder to get at it in China. The shale rock is a little bit different and the property rights are different. But let me just assure you that the world's history of leaving $20 bills buried in the ground unperturbed is an unbelievably short history. So like, someone is going to say, you know what, maybe we should get this stuff out of the ground. And by the way, if you're China, like, what is you're trying to deal with this air pollution problem, and the air pollution problem is basically a coal problem, and you say, wait a minute, I have all this natural gas sitting here, why don't I use it? Or why don't I import it from North America?
And finally, if you were to overlay on that chart of future abundance,
Yeah.
current abundance, the sum of solar, wind, water, and geothermal energy, what would it show, do you think?
Well, I mean,
Where
we
would the
have
line
an
be?
infinite amount of solar energy, but not at a price that we would use it at.
Currently, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, look, I don't mean to be too negative about the renewables. They're an important thing, and the price decline, they're an important component of the energy system, but the price declines have been remarkable. And if they did continue at the same rate, that would change things. But as I showed you, those projections from the IEA say that as in 2040, 74% of energy consumption is still coming from fossil fuels. So I think that's what I want to help reframe people's perspective. Like, unless we do something radically different, like price energy at its full cost, we are on the path to continuing to heavily rely on fossil fuels.
Thank you. Stimulating. So my question is kind of in that direction. Where have you seen, perhaps in the three countries that you focused on or any others, where have you seen sort of a real uptake in interest in economic model and these 3 points and policy change? Anybody focused on this right now?
I think people have taken off different parts of it. The U.S. has, beginning with the Clean Air Act in 1970, has, dramatically changed what air quality is like. Los Angeles used to be not that dissimilar to Beijing is today. The U.S. is also deeply committed to low energy prices, and as part of the hydraulic fracturing revolution is allowing that to go on. The U.S. is much less committed to doing something about CO2. So different parts of the world have kind of grabbed hold of different parts. And China, by the way, has announced that there will be a nationwide CO2 market. I think it's been delayed a little bit, but that's a big step forward.
Your focus seems to be on the pollution, but the pollution and the carbon footprint are not two separate things. Have you done a study of the carbon footprint trend in China and India? No, so for example,
no. So sorry. Go ahead.
for example, the EV, the great government support for EV proliferation is not exactly helping with the carbon. The provenance of electricity is still coal.
Yeah.
And so, I would imagine that if you look at it from the air quality point of view, yes, the EV will improve the air quality, but the carbon footprint is probably even worse than the gasoline fueled cars.
Yeah, no, so actually, that's kind of, I mean for that to be my thesis here, is that that's why this is such a tough problem, is that you have to keep three things in your mind at once, all at the same time. How do I get low energy prices? How do I deal with the pollution? And how do I deal with the CO2? And it's oftentimes energy policy is really focused on only one of those or two of those. And does not have a holistic picture. And really my thesis here is like ultimately societies are going to have to navigate between those different goals, and they're going to involve trade-offs, just as you pointed out. A policy that might be good for pollution might be bad for CO2. And I hope I've tried to illuminate that actually all three things are important.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I wanted to just go to one of your focus areas, your solutions, of focusing on energy R&D coupled with policy. So policy would be implication of the public sector. And I wonder, with the focus of energy R&D, how we mobilize this sort of trend of green finance and those people that are shifting their capital or trying to leverage more capital in this area. Is there a potential for policy to help move that or leverage that private capital to less trendy green finance and actually moving it towards the types of projects that you've just worked on in India, in China, because they've announced too that they are going to need to leverage a lot of private capital. So does that mean then, if it's going to fit the criteria of green finance, will it then go towards R&D for renewable type energy? Because they're not going to put green finance into coal.
Yeah. So the way I think about it, the best thing you could do to leverage, it's called green investment, is to actually have the market reward green investment. And right now, basically doesn't most parts of the world, because energy prices don't reflect pollution costs and they don't reflect CO2 costs. So the first thing of pricing energy at its full cost, that is the most effective thing you could do to leverage green finance. Investing in energy R&D, what I really mean there is like in basic science that companies don't have an incentive to invest in because their idea can be appropriated by someone else. And there's a strong role for government investment in those settings.
So many environmental policies, like air pollution control policy in China, aims to reduce air pollution permanently. We know many papers are actually using a short-run variation in air pollution. So the question is, are these short-run estimates very useful to make for these long-run policies? And we also know it's kind of hard to estimate the long-run or sustained exposure to air pollution, the effect of sustained exposure to air pollution. Like people can migrate, for example. Then what's your suggestion to make?
Yeah, no. So I think a great appeal of that Huai River study is it's one of the very few, if not the only, that can make a plausible claim that we're learning about long-run exposure because of the lack of migration. And so if I see you in the north and your huko's in the north, you probably were there for your whole life. But I completely agree. The point of policy is to affect long-run concentrations and long-run exposure, and that's what I think the power of that paper is.
Mike, can you move back to the two of China charts about the heat?
Which one?
Heat, no heat.
Oh, yeah.
Almost. Oh, okay. The next one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very curious how the life expectancy rate is lower, first of all, as you go further away
Yeah.
from the divider
Yeah.
line, and then it goes up, and then
Yeah. So
I can see why the drop
Yeah,
takes
yeah.
place there, but
it's a great question. So what I'm wedding myself to here is a regression discontinuity design. And I'm putting all of my eggs on the table with what happens right at the line. I don't know what's happening in a way, but nor is it the econometric model set up to provide much insight into it. It's really, the whole thing lives and dies on whether or not there's a discrete change right at the border. And what's striking is there is discrete change. It's also striking that if I ran fake Huai River tests, so I displaced the discontinuity in either direction, there's no evidence of a discrete change in particulates or life expectancy at any other latitude change. So I don't claim to understand what's going on here, and I don't claim to understand what's going on there, nor for the test I've imposed on the data do I think it's very important. But it is certainly interesting, but I don't have a good answer.
the left vote circle is for Hong Kong. Hong Kong.
But it's north of the border.
No, this would be south of the border, because it's minus 15. Yeah. I don't know, is that Hong Kong or Guangzhou or? Yeah.
Oh, hello.
I mean, I should add, what the power of looking for this discrete jump is that you don't think, like, obviously there's enormous wealth differences between Hong Kong and right at the border. And by comparing places just south and north of the border, the idea is that there shouldn't be any of those other differences.
But in general, one would expect the life expectancy to be lower in the north than in the south. But your chart shows.
That's right, but yes, but I don't, yes, okay, I understand, yeah.
Okay. Do you think it's more likely or easier for countries with a sound democracy system versus countries without a sound democracy system to take up their full responsibility for solving these problems, especially in light of Trump, the median voter theorem, the sole rule of China?
Yeah, so I'll just say this report that I released 2 weeks ago is China winning the war on pollution. Without judgment, I'm just going to report that in 4 years, China's reduction in air pollution that they achieved in particulate matter was as large as the United States reduction in the first 12 years after the Clean Air Act, including a vicious recession from 1981 to 1982. So you can draw your own, it's one data point, I guess it's 2 data points. You can draw it, it's very hard to answer broad questions like democracy when you don't have very many data points. But here's 2 data points and you can draw your own inference from it.
On this point, actually, let me say that if you use the data prior to the decision to get serious on pollution in China, you may draw the opposite. The Chinese system also made it easier to add and accumulate a lot of pollution very fast. Of course, when they want to do it, take it out, then of course it can also be very fast.
Yep. Yeah, I think it just wasn't a goal before, it wasn't an important goal before.
Thanks so much. Just a question about your first recommendation about pricing energy with the full social cost. A lot of people advocate a global price on carbon, but don't know how to get from here to there. So institutionally, if you were to drop a plan that would give us some degree of political likelihood of achieving a global price on carbon, be it fully loaded social cost or even just carbon cost, how do we get there from here? And which global body would even convene that conversation?
Yeah. So I think the world spent a lot of time thinking that we're going to get a global price on carbon, a uniform global price, and a lot of energy on that. I kind of think the Copenhagen conference was the end of that. I think there was a recognition at the end of that different countries see it in a very different way. And short of transfers of like hundreds of billions of dollars across borders, which seems unlikely, there's just, I don't, in my own views, I don't know what that organization would be that would impose a global price on carbon, particularly once you recognize that like the price on carbon that India might find in its own interest is extraordinarily different than the price on carbon that France or the United States might find in its own interest. And I don't see, the only tool I know to resolve that is money. And I don't think we're going to have a lot of shipment of money across borders to support different prices on carbon. So I don't think that's happening, is my view. I think it's going to require independent, a bunch of countries coming together, kind of in the mode of the Paris Agreement, and making confidence-building movements in a particular direction.
Is that what you envision for your recommendation?
Sorry?
Is that what you envision for your first recommendation? Or is that, are you envisioning more of a national approach to?
I think there will be, my first recommendation, I didn't say who would do it, but I said that energy markets would work a lot better if prices reflected it. In terms of the pollution part, you don't need any international anything for that. It's in every country's own interest. It's the CO2 part that's complicated. So I understand there's a slight gloominess to that, but I just don't see how you ever get around that the problem looks so different when you're sitting in Bihar than it does when you're sitting in Paris. Now I'll add one, there's one the Trojan horse here would be innovation. If you could actually get it so that the low carbon energy sources were not so expensive relative to fossil fuels, then I think that's a pathway. And that's something rich countries could invest a lot in making it happen, and then you could imagine kind of technology transfer things. So until the cost of low carbon energy sources comes down relative to fossil fuels, because the cost of fossil fuels are coming down too, it's a heavy lift, as they would say.
I'm going to come back to carbon. I have two interrelated questions. Number one is that I live in Beijing from 2010 to 2014. I saw the most dramatic aggravation of air quality.
Yeah.
And there, the locals...
You were there for the revolution, the beginning of the revolution, yeah.
The local residents complain that the weather pattern has also been different from before. So that raised the possibility of a kind of a double whammy, the greenhouse effect plus the particulate accumulation. Now, has there been a study of the greenhouse effect, or the localized global warming in the overall heavy pollution, the very visible smogs in cities like Beijing? The interrelated question is, now, if there is some interaction there, would you predict that the rapid improvement that over the last 4 years, it would be sustainable? You know, if they are related, then sooner or later, carbon will come in play, and the emission will come in play, and the greenhouse effect will basically prevent the air quality from getting any better beyond a certain point. Right?
Yeah. So. This is not, I would say, this is not at the edges of what I know about. The only thing I'll point to is that in many respects, which I think you're making a different point, but a related point here is that the world has probably been benefiting from all the use of coal in terms of temperature increase, because it's been putting sulfates in the atmosphere that are reflecting back some of the sun and kind of acting as a accidental geoengineering project. And to the degree that we moved away from using coal, and we might actually have more warming because those sulfates would no longer be up there. But to the heart of your question about the interaction, it's not an area that I know enough about to really say something confidently. But it's an important area.
Actually, my response is to your question. So, actually, when I was a student at MIT, you were still teaching at MIT, and while I was a postdoc, I conducted the co-benefit study. So, if Chinese government the constraint like air pollution, what will happen on greenhouse gas reduction side? I actually, together with my former MIT colleagues, actually, I published a couple of articles on that. In that direction. So our key finding was that like the existing like the 5-year plan carbon intensity reduction targets are way more moderate than NOx and SO2 abatement targets. So our key finding was that like the actually carbon reduction target is not binding if NOx and SO2 reduction targets are met. So it will just generate unnecessary compliance cost. So what I mean is that like the carbon reduction expected when NOx and SO2 targets are met actually is even greater than carbon reduction you can expect when carbon intensity reduction targets are met. So if you're interested, probably I can send you a paper on that topic.
Any more questions? Okay, well, this is a great lecture. I cannot help but think that besides price changes to reflect the costs of all the energy sources, a lot of institutional reforms may also help. I know, like for Hong Kong, many of my friends, when they come to visit, they tend to complain, the air conditioning it's so hot here. So especially when the outside temperature is not that hot, everywhere you go, it's always so cold. So I guess that having the temperatures raised a little bit may actually save the environmental damage quite a bit. And then during the winter times, when I visit Beijing, there's no thermometer in the rooms. So there's always this centrally controlled temperature control, right? So what people end up doing is they just open their windows during the winter time in order to make the room temperature acceptable, because otherwise it's always too hot anywhere you go. So anyway, you wonder about the incentives that are not there to really make them adopt thermometers to control the room temperatures instead of forcing everyone to open the windows all the time. Okay, well, thank you, Mike. Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for coming, and especially also our staff who have done such a wonderful job.